Hi, this is Terrence Revo. As a member of the Senior Lawyers Division, we are going to discuss and take an oral history from Justice, what's your first name? Richard Bosson. Today is the 19th of August, 2022, and Justice Bosson has been kind enough to agree to sit with us and kind of talk about his history as a lawyer and as a judge and as a justice in various aspects of New Mexico law and politics. So, Justice, would you state your full name, please?
Richard C. Bosson. I live in Santa Fe. Lived there for almost 45 years.
Well, thank you for agreeing to do this oral history.
My pleasure.
Now, you're all tied down and jacketed and looking very formal, but this is somewhat of an informal discussion.
Okay.
And that's
Good.
the way that we try and do it. We'd like you to feel comfortable.
You want me to look at you or look at the camera?
You should probably look at the camera.
Okay.
I can probably get a little closer.
Yeah, get a
to
little
make
bit closer.
it easier for you.
I've done this kind of thing. This is not my first rodeo, so that's why I asked that question.
All right. Justice Bosson, what is your current status as a judge?
Fully retired. I'm still an active member of the bar, so I have to pay my $400 or $500 a year, and I still have to get my CLA credits, and I'll do that for a while longer. Partially out of respect and loyalty, and partially because I still get called on to act as a judge from time to time, and you have to be a full active member for that.
When did you actually formally retire?
The last day of October 2015.
That day will forever be part of your memory.
It will be, yes.
Did you have a party when you retired?
We had the party about a month earlier because Santa Fe is, we had it on the roof of the La Fonda Hotel, which is outdoors.
Right.
Santa Fe in September is exquisite. In October, not so much, outdoors. So we had the party, and then I just kept on working for a month, and then left at the end of October.
Can you give us an overview of your legal career after law school?
Okay, that covers a lot of territory. I came to New Mexico the day after Labor Day, 1969, right out of law school, Georgetown Law School. I had grown up in the East Coast. I wanted to go west for various reasons. I had a job offer from the Legal Aid Society of Albuquerque. But more than that, I had a fellowship from the Office of Economic Opportunity, part of the War on Poverty, and they had a big program called the Reginald Heber Smith Fellowship, which they gave to 200-300 graduates of law school a year. And they sent them to legal aids all over the country, sort of as a revitalizing new energy, and they also paid the salary. So for legal aids, it was a net plus, no matter what happened. And I came that year with 3 other people. Interesting how well we've done. Those 3 people are Chuck Dumars, one of the foremost water attorneys in the world, Paul Bardeke, former Attorney General, distinguished trial lawyer, and Michael Browdy, professor at the law school, longtime professor, and I was the 4th. And I think the 4 of us have done pretty good.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. How long were you with Legal Aid?
So I was with Legal Aid approximately 5 years. During that time, we also started the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund in New Mexico. I don't think they still have an office here, but they did for a long time. They're still active in New Mexico. And so we started that as well. But about 5 years at Legal Aid, I can break my practice down into about 3 segments. The 1970s were legal aid. I took a year off and traveled with my wife to Bogota, Colombia, where we were loosely associated with the law school there. Came back, went to work for the Attorney General's office, which you recall.
Yes.
And where I was deputy of the civil division. for about 3 years, then went into private practice. The private practice would be the second phase of my career for about 15 years, more or less, in Santa Fe. Small, exclusively civil trial work, some document preparation, that kind of work. And then in 1994, I was appointed by Governor King to the Court of Appeals. And there's stories there, we should get into it if we need to. And so starting in 1994, I went on the Court of Appeals. I finished as Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals in 2002, and then went to the Supreme Court in the very end of 2002, where I was until 2015. So I have about 21 and a half years as judge, which, not surprisingly, was the cap of really the peak of my career, being a judiciary.
Sure. Who appointed you to the Supreme Court?
I was not appointed to the Supreme. I was appointed to the Court of Appeals by Governor King. In 2001, Justice Baca announced that he was going to retire. He announced to people close to him, like me, in advance that he was going to retire in the middle of 2001. You think of who was governor at the time, it was not the same party as Justice Baca, so he wasn't going to. We never talked about this, but I can't imagine he would have given that appointment to Garrett Johnson. So he left in the middle of the year, 2001, and left it up to the political parties to nominate someone. So I was nominated by the Democrats in a very hard-fought battle to get the nomination. And then I won in the general election.
Who was your opponent?
In the general election?
Yes.
Paul Barber, who was a former district judge, briefly a district judge in Albuquerque. And my opponent in the primary was Ira Robinson.
All right. Very, very interesting, because Ira was very politically well connected at that time.
Yes, indeed. I can tell you some stories about that, but this is a family version show, so I'll just leave it at that. We had a very hard-fought campaign, and I eventually prevailed.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. You've identified a number of lawyers and judges that were part of your legal career. With whom were you the closest?
I didn't have many mentors in the legal profession and being a lawyer. I kind of learned myself on the job, made mistakes, learned from that. Probably the guy who helped me out the most in my private practice was a lawyer named Matt Zamora from Santa Fe, who's recently deceased. He became a good friend and very helpful to me. There are others probably, but I can't think of them right now. Now, judges, on the other hand, I had a lot of help from a lot of people, going way, way back. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, sure.
Well, even when I was with the Attorney General's office in the late 70s, I befriended Vern Payne and Dan Sosa, who were both on the Supreme Court at that time. And you know, in those days, things were a lot more informal and relaxed. I would just walk across the street and go up to their offices in the Supreme Court, and we'd just shoot the breeze and we'd talk. We wouldn't talk about any cases, but we'd talk about I was looking for advice, and they were free with their advice. And we became good friends, and they were very helpful to me early in my career. Maybe 10 years later, my wife managed the campaign for Stanley Frost, former district judge from Tucumcari, who was appointed by Bruce King to the Supreme Court, had lost a statewide race 2 years before, 4 years before, something like that. And so he was very concerned this time. So he hired my wife, who knows a thing or two about politics, and she ran his campaign. And and it was successful. As a result, we became very good friends. He and his wife, Bonnie, and Gloria, and I would have dinner frequently, share stories, have some drinks, talk about the future. And actually it was Stanley who called me in 1994 to alert me to the fact that there was going to be an opening on the Court of Appeals. And he advised me to go for it. which eventually I did. Once on the Court of Appeals, I became close with several people on the Supreme Court. Gene Franchini, Dick Ransom, Stanley Frost, of course, Joe Baca to a lesser degree, and Seth Montgomery. I really didn't know personally, but I had enormous respect for him. And then on the Court of Appeals, my colleagues there, people like Tom Donnelly, who I'd known as a trial judge, and he was a wonderful colleague on the Court of Appeals. And I mean, there were 10 people there, and I became on good close terms with all of them. And then later on, once I got on the court, you had Pamela Minster and Ed Chavez and Charlie Daniels. It's amazing that people are no longer with us. That group, and they passed away young, so young. So I had a lot of help in the judiciary, a lot of advice and counsel, and I valued that a lot.
Well, you've had contact with some really wonderful and high-functioning people during the course of your experiences as a judge.
It helped me immensely, all in different ways, and the relationships were different. Gene Franchini was a very personal relationship. He and his wife Glenn, you knew, and his daughter, who's now district judge in Albuquerque. We would have a lot of dinners together and talk, and he gave me a lot of good advice over the years.
Gene was a very special guy.
He was. He definitely was.
So, back in 1994, when you became interested in becoming a judge, what was it about the idea of being an appellate court judge that interested you?
Well, I was interested long before that. I was interested even in law school about being an appellate judge. In the abstract, nothing concrete. But I went to law school at Georgetown, and one of the nice benefits of that was if you wanted a break from studying, you just walk down the street and there's the U.S. Supreme Court. Or you walk over to the Capitol building and you could listen to some of the great Senate orators of the day. I was fascinated by politics and by Washington and what I saw. I actually went to law school because I was involved by and inspired by the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I was active in that as a college student. Went to the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King gave this famous speech. Spent a summer working on voter registration and other issues in Mississippi in 1965, which is long stories there as well. But one of the things you saw there were the lawyers who volunteered for that work. There were young lawyers from law schools all over the country who were there to file lawsuits and protect the people who were working in civil rights. And so I said to myself, being a lawyer is a pretty good thing. I took a class in college, which was all about reviewing Supreme Court cases, a lot of them being in this area. And so I was inspired by that era, very different from now, unfortunately. And I thought maybe someday the opportunity for me might come about. But of course, you have to put that on hold for a while you develop a reputation and you learn a thing or two until your time comes. And so once actually, little story, when Stanley Frost called me, I initially said to myself, nah, I'm not gonna go now. I'm really enjoying the practice. Bruce King was governor, he'll always be governor. That year, later on, he was defeated in the election. And then my wife came home. She was gone for a day or two. She came home and I told her all about that. She said, are you out of your mind? This is the chance that you've been looking for your entire career. Don't turn your back on this. And of course, it was good advice.
You've referenced your wife several times. What is her name?
Her name is Gloria. Gloria, her maiden name was Candelaria. She's from the West Mesa in Albuquerque. I met her at legal aid. She ran one of the offices, one of the district offices. We started to date, and one thing led to another. One reason why I stayed in New Mexico, in addition to just loving the place.
when, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later.
Okay.
When you were at Georgetown, did you have the opportunity to meet many of the New Mexicans that went to law school at Georgetown?
Actually, I don't remember any. A lot of them, if they were sponsored by like Senator Montoya and people like that, they went to night school, so they could work during the day. So of course I was in day school, so I didn't really get a chance to meet them and found out later about people like Tony Anaya, Benny Flores, and on. Many others, Nick Franklin, who were at Georgetown during that time. I remember talking to a guy in the faculty at Georgetown who was, again, sort of a guide, gave me guidance. And he said, well, if you're going to New Mexico, there's one guy you got to look up, and that's Jack McManus. We called him Black Jack McManus. And he was a district judge here in Albuquerque, and then went up to the Supreme Court, where he served for approximately 10 years, maybe a little less, before he had a heart attack prematurely. And he was a very colorful character, McManus. There is a big connection with Georgetown, both undergraduate and graduate. And of course, over the years, I've got to know Fred Hart and his wife and his family, and wonderful people with a Georgetown connection.
Yeah, I always wondered about that because there's so many of the really good attorneys here in New Mexico that went to law school at Georgetown.
Absolutely.
And I always wondered what the connection was and who made it and what made it possible.
Well, there was a conscious effort going back in the 60s by the Congress people and the senators to sponsor local kids. Tony and I was among that group. Through the connection with the school, provided a scholarship, a job, an opportunity to study at a fine institution. They took advantage of it. Look what happened.
Yeah, that's absolutely great. I'm going to skip a little bit on you, and I want to thank you for, that was just a wonderful rendition of an overview of your experience in the law here in New Mexico. And I think that people are going to be very pleased.
Well, good.
When
they are. I also owe a great deal of debt to two people in public life. One was Tony and I, who gave me my first job at the Attorney General's office, and was a very inspirational figure at that time. That's a long time ago, and a lot of people weren't around then, but I remember he was the most popular public official in the state during that time, and he taught me a lot and encouraged me to go into public life at some point. And the second would be Bruce King, who gave me the appointment at the appropriate time.
That's wonderful. Let's talk about now. You've been retired a number of years, 5, 6 years. What do you do in your retirement?
Well, unfortunately, I've had a lot of joints go bad on me, so I've had surgeries, joint replacement surgeries and things like that. I'm in my late 70s now, so you begin to fall apart. I've been fortunate that both appellate courts have called me from time to time to sit on cases. A couple of years ago, when the Court of Appeals had a huge backlog, you probably remember that, it caused them a lot of trouble. And 3 or 4 of us, alumni of that court, volunteered and stepped forward to sit on panels and help move cases. And so I did a lot of that at one time. Not so much anymore. I think they've got their things together more now than they did at the time. The Supreme Court will call me if they have a need for someone to sit in. So that's one reason I keep my license. I'm active on 3 nonprofits, some of which you know. One is the commissioner on the Board of Commissioners for the Public Defender. I was appointed by Chief Justice Nakamura to sit on that. That's a wonderful experience, being on that, a great group of people. I'm on the board of the Center on Law and Poverty, based in Albuquerque, that, among other things, brought the famous Yazzie case, the education case, that it continues to annoy and drive crazy the legislature and everybody else. It's an ongoing case. Will take years before it's finally resolved. I'm president of the board of an association called New Mexico Ethics Watch, which is a kind of a watchdog group for ethics violations in New Mexico. That's a much smaller operation. Those are the three nonprofits. Recently, I was president of the board of New Mexico Civil Rights Commission, which was formed for one purpose, to put through the Civil Rights Act, which eventually did get through the legislature one session ago, became law last summer, prospective only, so we'll see what cases are brought now, but it's going to have a huge impact on New Mexico. That process took about 6 months to get that through.
So that's kind of like you stayed within the legal framework in terms of those activities.
To a great extent, yeah.
What are you and your wife, Gloria, doing in terms of your retirement and now your ability to do other things?
Right. The usual things there. We see our kids, we see our grandkids, we travel a lot. We were traveling a lot internationally until COVID hit, and that put a stop to that. But we have some trips planned next year and the year after, and continuing on. So my wife is a former travel agent, so she loves to travel. I encouraged her to do that and created a monster.
Do you play golf or any sports?
Took up golf maybe 10 years ago, and lately I've been able to spend more time doing it. I like that a lot.
It's really interesting how being on the golf course, the rest of the world tends to fade away.
That's right. And there's no such thing as an ugly golf course. They're all beautiful.
That's just wonderful. I mean, it's really good.
And I have a group I play with, and I play with my wife too. We have a regular game. We play together.
You had mentioned that you went down to Mississippi
Right.
in 1965.
Right.
As I think back to those days, that was pretty dangerous. Can you talk about what it was like being down there, the work that was being done, and the hassles you received from people you didn't expect or did expect?
Yeah, I don't want to get too deeply into that. It's if you've seen the movie Mississippi Burning,
Mm-hmm.
that's a pretty accurate depiction of what it was like, in fact. And that movie depicted, I think, 1964, when they were looking for those 3 civil rights workers and found them shot and buried in an earth dam. I was there the summer after that. It hadn't changed much. Terrifying a lot of the time, because the local power structure did not like the fact that we were there from outside the state. Could have been the north, the west, the east, didn't matter, anywhere but the south. And that we were causing trouble just by advising people of their rights. Earlier that summer, 1965, I was with a group that lobbied, in quotes, the Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965. I certainly was not alone in doing that, but I remember going into the office of congressmen and senators and giving my pitch, on the Voting Rights Act. And it did pass that summer, and so that when I went down tonight to Mississippi, my job was to proselytize and educate about this brand new statute that people couldn't believe was actually law. It had given them these rights that they had never had. And so I gave talks all over the state on that subject and made a lot of friends. But I also had some very scary moments. That Mississippi is a very rural and dark state, dark at night. And once you leave the city, there's no protection, period.
Right.
You can disappear, they never find you. And I had some confrontations. I'm not going to go into details, but it was scary. It was scary, and I don't think I've ever been back there, and I don't think I ever will.
Well, that was going to kind of be my next question. What about that experience kind of structured you in terms of your subsequent attitude towards life and the law?
Well, you see, it opened a window to me, the role of lawyers in the law, and of course judges, in our society generally, in protecting and vindicating rights long buried in the Constitution, and enabling people to have liberty and live freely. They had not been able to do that since right after the Civil War. And so you see the power of the law. You see the majesty of the law and the good it can do for the world, for our country. And once you get a taste of that, you know, you don't lose it. There are things you can do, but nothing quite as big as that. And so that really caused me to go to law school, and then being in Washington just furthered that interest that I had in this aspect. I could have done a lot of other things as a young law graduate, but this was what interested me the most.
That's fascinating, really fascinating.
And when I became a judge in 1994, I'll share this old story with you. I go in, I talk to the chief clerk who settles me down, shows me what I sign papers, she talks to me about retirement, all that sort of stuff, and then leads me to my office. And I'm at this big office, this big desk, that's completely empty, unlike my desk in private practice. And all I had was a stack of files, cases that I was assigned to. And so I took one stack and I read the briefs, you know, hurriedly to find out what the case is about. Took another one, read those briefs as well. And I can still remember this. I turned my chair around, looked out the window, and said to myself, now I remember. This is why I went to law school. I had that epiphany, that moment at the time. And I also had to say to myself in modesty, I said, you know, I know people who can do this job just as well as I can. And I even know someone could probably do it better. But you know, I'm here, they're not. And I'm just going to move forward and never look back.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. So let's go back to your early life.
Okay.
Is there anything in your childhood or your adolescence or education that influenced your direction in life?
Not directly. I mean, my parents were both well-educated, believed totally in education. And so when I talk with people about their high school experience, I went to a very demanding, educationally demanding private school. And so whereas other people were out partying at night, I was doing homework, including on the weekends. Very difficult school. But it gave me a lot, you know, discipline and knowledge. My mom was the vice chair of the state of Connecticut League of Women Voters, so she had a little bit of politics in her blood. My dad, no, he was an insurance executive, a very smart guy. But no, in terms of the life that I eventually took, I think they were very surprised, even shocked, that I went down this path and was so successful at it.
So back then, did you believe that you were going to be a lawyer or you were going to be in the law, and did they know about that?
Well, that sort of realization came with the civil rights experience when I was, say, in the middle of college, towards the end of college. So they knew about it in the sense of what I told them. And they, in fact, I remember my dad put me in touch with a private lawyer, a personal friend of ours, and he talked to me about the law. But that was a very different kind of law from what I was going to do. It was just very much more conventional.
So what was it that kind of lit that fire while you were an undergraduate student, where you started to really think about the law and you started to think about people's rights and what was going on in the country?
Well, you got to remember the time. I was in college from 1963 through 1966. So you think about it, that's right in the middle of the civil rights era, and also the beginnings of the Vietnam War. So the judiciary, the law, and lawyers as advocates they were the heroes of young people during that time. And I can remember having that attitude years ago. Those are people you wanted to be like. You wanted to make a difference, leave an imprint on the world, have an impact in some way. I always wanted that, I just didn't know exactly how it was going to take place. But I remember saying to my wife, I think I can do something, but I'm going to need your help. And thankfully she gave it to me.
And how about your parents? Were they aware of what your orientation was starting to be while you were still an undergraduate?
Yeah.
Did they encourage you, discourage you?
Oh, neither. I mean, my dad was, had a very conventional life and career. Was very successful in the insurance business. He was an executive with Connecticut General Life Insurance. This is Hartford, Connecticut, which is where I grew up, the insurance capital of the world, right? At least at that time. So everybody we knew was with one insurance company or another. My mom had been in theater as a student and had been a very top-notch debater as a student in high school. In fact, she grew up in a town called, my father was from Boston, and his family were Harvard-educated lawyers. In fact, his grandfather, my great-grandfather, was a judge in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and his portrait is still hanging in the library, the public library in that town. My mom grew up in a small town, poor town in upstate New York called Ilion, New York. It's in the Mohawk Valley. You're from Buffalo, you know the area.
Yes.
Where there really isn't a lot of work. There was a lot of work in Ilion because that's where the Remington Arms plant was, the factory, where every rifle and for a while typewriters were produced by Remington. My grandfather worked on the assembly line at the Remington plant. And if you look at your average hunting rifle, and you look at the barrel, you'll see inscribed Ilion, New York. You don't have any idea what that means. This is just a small town. But that's where my mom came from, and because she was such a good debater, she won a state-sponsored scholarship to go to Cornell University, which she never could have afforded, that kind of stretch. And that's where she met my dad, who was there as well. So that.
Interesting, very interesting. You talked about your education, what inspired you to go to law school. When you were in law school, were there any professors or role models that kind of moved you forward in terms of your search for justice?
Yeah.
That's really what you've been talking about.
You know, I had some professors who, with whom I would talk from time to time and about that, and they were very encouraging to me. But part of law school, of course, is not really going in with a preconceived plan and necessarily going down that same road. Law school is about opening up everything, all the avenues, all the windows. So for a while, I saw myself as a corporate lawyer. I saw myself as a prosecutor. I saw, the whole bit. I worked on Wall Street during one summer to see what that was like. Decided that really was not probably for me. But the most memorable part is I went to see the play Hair. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
Broadway. There's not a direct relationship. There wasn't a professor there who emphasized civil rights. There probably would be now. My senior year, I did win the moot court competition for the school. And if you go to Georgetown, they have a brand new campus now, beautiful place. It was a dump before, honestly. And they have the moot court room where they have those competitions. And over the door, inscribed are all the former winners. I brought my wife back there years ago, my daughter, who had been accepted at Georgetown. And lo and behold, that was my name. I pointed out there's my name. We took some pictures. That was kind of neat.
Well, you mentioned your daughter. Any other children?
I have a son and a daughter. The son's about 45, the daughter's about 42. Son just had his first baby. She's about 3 months old. He's getting no sleep. and asked me, when is this gonna change? I said, son, just wait, be patient. Eventually, it'll change. He's a police officer, detective outside of Chicago. And my daughter lives in Golden, Colorado. Her husband's a lawyer. Commercial lawyer, I would say, commercial litigation. And she works for nonprofits in administration of nonprofits.
Is she a lawyer also?
No, she's not a lawyer. She got her master's in public policy at Georgetown.
Seems to be a thread here.
Yeah, there's a thread. And that was, of course, if you're going to get a degree in public policy, other than maybe Harvard, that's about the best place you could go, is in Washington, D.C.
For sure.
Yeah.
When you started law school in what year?
66, law school, fall of 66 through
Were-
69.
Were there any women in your class?
Well, if you use binoculars, you could find one or two. We had a class, Georgetown's a huge law school, and they divided up the classes alphabetically. I think there were 2 or 3 separate classes. So I was in the group from A to H, I think, A to G. And that group was probably 200, 250 students, just in that group. Out of that number of students, there were 5 women, 5. And the guys were merciless in the way they treated them. They thought it was just a big joke. I don't think the women thought it was a joke. What are you doing in law school? You're just taking up a position a man could have. You're just going to go back and have babies and be a mom. You shouldn't even think about law school. If you said that kind of thing now, you know where you'd end up, and rightfully so. But this was another era, you know. And I didn't see a lot of women in the law until mid-70s, back in New Mexico at UNM, where this explosion took place. And years later, most of my law clerks at both the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court were from UNM, intentionally. I did that. And most were women. And why? Because they were the top students. Just pure and simple that. And I think they still are.
Yeah, things have definitely changed over the
And now
years.
you see a lot of judges. Over time, those young lawyers have become judges. And now on the Supreme Court, they're what, 3 out of 5, I think, are women. I think, yeah.
You've answered a number of the questions that I have on my sheet. You talked about the practice of law before you became a judge. You said it was basically a civil practice.
Small firm. I had 1 or 2 partners and myself. Did mainly civil practice, real property, personal injury, contractual disputes, other things. And I also kept my hand in public service. I and another guy were bond counsel for the state during the Anaya administration. He even asked me to fill in as banking commissioner for the state of New Mexico, which I did for about 3 months until I could find a replacement who actually knew what they were talking about. But yeah, I did it as a favor to the governor. And so I did a variety of things in the law, but always with an eye towards something else after that.
It sounds like you had a very strong relationship with former Governor Anaya.
I did. Tony took an interest in me. Stepping back a little bit, Tony and I was one of the youngest attorney generals we'd ever had. He was only maybe 2 years older than me, maybe 3. And so he related to all the attorneys in the office who were about the same age as him. So we had this wonderfully symbiotic relationship with him, where he would sit almost as a mentor and talk about things that were going on and people he talked to and the issues he was confronted with. And I got a first-hand window seat watching him move. And he encouraged me to get into public life, which I did, first unsuccessfully and then successfully. But he was the guy who lit that fire, saw something in me which was already there in terms of an interest, but he's the one who really pushed me.
How many years were you with the Attorney General's office?
Only 3 years. Only 3 out of Tony's 4 years, and there were only 4 years allowed at the time. And then Jeff Bangman came in, and because I had run against Jeff Bangman for Attorney General, obviously I had to leave. And so that caused me to go into private practice.
What about your time with the Attorney General's office was most significant for you?
Well, I started off as just a lawyer in the Consumer Protection Division, but I impressed Tony and his people with my abilities, and so he made me director of the Civil Division when that position opened up. And that's what I did most of the time, was be head of that. Now, the Civil Division acts as in-house counsel to almost all of state government. One of the things Tony and I had never done before, he consolidated, and before he was Attorney General, every agency had their own attorneys, spread out all over Santa Fe and all over New Mexico. He brought them all in one roof under his control. Huge change. And so I don't even remember how many attorneys were in the Civil Division, but there were a lot. And they represented all these agencies, and handled disputes and advice to what in-house counsel does. And I was in charge of superintending all of that. So that was a tremendous educational experience, learning about state government, learning about what an in-house lawyer does, and its importance and how to do it, and how the people that I met proved very important later on in life. And then watching Tony, I mean, he was quite a successful politician. I learned a lot from him.
Were you there when the prison blew up?
No, Jeff got that honor. He beat me in the election, and then as a reward, he had to take care of the riot, which was the most significant event in anybody's life during that time.
Even though you weren't in the AG's office anymore at the time of the riot, did you have any connection to the riot, the state's position, any of the attorneys who were representing the inmates?
No, not directly. I was involved in a lawsuit against the prison around that time. It was not connected to the riot. It was connected to prison not handling their inmates correctly according to the rules. And that's where I got my first. I'll tell you something about that institution. Years later, I represented, when I worked as a contract counsel for risk management briefly, and they gave me this corrections department case. An inmate had been beaten up badly and got counsel. Counsel was suing the corrections department. And the essence of the case was, this guy had been a gang member, and he'd been a gang member of a rival gang. And yet the prison put him in the general population where the other gang members could get him. And they did. They got him, beat him up terribly. So I remember talking to a deputy warden in the Department of Corrections. This is state government at its best and worst. I said, Warden, the allegations are this, about the gangs and everything. And he says, well, that's not possible. Why is that? We don't allow gangs in the prison of New Mexico. There are no gangs. It says right there in the rule book, no gangs. I'm thinking to myself, is this for real? What am I supposed to do with this? Living in another world of fantasy land.
That's usually the position that prison officials take.
Yeah.
And that's true in New Mexico, or was
True anywhere.
in New Mexico.
Yeah.
It's really true anywhere.
Yeah.
Denial is an important part of how.
And that is part is what led to the riots. There have been whispers for years about the unrest and dissension and alleged abuse by guards and all that sort of stuff that came to light. But nobody did anything about it until it just blew. And then everybody said, well, we didn't know. Well, maybe not, but that kind of thing just doesn't happen overnight.
I'd like to switch to talk a little bit more about your judicial career.
Yes.
Now, you told us the time periods. You told us that you were with the appellate court, with the Supreme Court, and your length of service. Let's talk about the Court of Appeals first.
Sure.
significant cases that you were in on and that you helped to decide?
I knew you were going to ask me that question, and I'm going to disappoint you because I really can't recall specific names. I authored so many opinions and signed off on so many opinions. I can remember a couple from the Supreme Court, but the Court of Appeals is largely a blank slate. I will tell you this, the Court of Appeals was the best pure legal judicial job anybody could ever have. I love the Court of Appeals because there was one function and one function only: write opinions. File your opinions, get 3 more at the end of the month, the beginning of the next month, get those out, 3 more, and on it went. And of all kinds, criminal, civil, you name it, administrative. It was a great legal education, a great education of the breadth of our precedents throughout the state. And at least at that time, the Court of Appeals, all the judges, there were 10, were all of the same view. They loved being on that court. They loved helping each other out. It was very collegial. There were Republicans, there were Democrats. None of that mattered. People just worked together to develop the law in a fair and just way. Flash forward to the Supreme Court. I loved being on the Supreme Court. Very different job. Writing opinions is only one part of what really is 3 or 4 jobs in one, being a Supreme Court justice. And there are only 5 of you instead of 10. There's writing opinions, there's dealing with all the administrative aspects with the administrative office of the courts. The court is essentially the board of directors for the entire judiciary, from north to south, east to west. And the Chief Justice, where I was for 2 years, is the CEO. And like any other arrangement like that, every problem that you can possibly have flows uphill. Uphill to the court and to the Chief Justice. And I remember talking to people and saying, this is a minor personnel dispute from Lovington. Nobody else can resolve this but me in this huge place. Frustration, you know. There's running all of the rules and the rules committees. There's the politics involved. You're dealing with the legislature. You're dealing with the governor's office, the 3 separate branches of government. There's the politics within the judiciary, keeping good relations with all the chief judges in the state and the other judges. You could spend, and then there's writing opinions, and you could spend full time doing any one of those jobs, and you suddenly have to figure out a way to do all of them and keep everybody satisfied. And that's the main challenge of being on the Supreme Court. It's a huge job, huge, but very rewarding. Very rewarding, because a lot of those things need doing, and then writing the opinions, you're the final word on most everything that happens. We were reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court once. It still stings even today. We were right, they were wrong, but they have the last word. And that was a great thing, because most of the cases that you deal with are important. They're important questions. The parties are looking for answers, the lawyers, the bar is looking for answers, the judges are looking for answers. And in some cases, society as a whole. Take a water case, there's a lot of people looking for guidance on that. Oil and gas case, lots of people looking for what's the next development. And in criminal law, well, you know, that's like, it's hectic as it can be. So, enormous responsibility, which I really, really loved. Every day, I loved every day in both those jobs. Every day I came to work, walked into the building, and with a smile on my face. Every day.
You are and were a very fortunate man.
Yes.
To feel that way about the work that you were doing.
Many times I had that discussion with myself. Do you know how many people are not happy? If I had stayed in the law, you know, and not gone to the court, would I have had the same attitude? Probably not. At some point you get tired of the fight, which is what litigation is, just the fight.
From one of I've had this discussion many times with attorneys at the level at which I practice, which is basically a street practice.
Right.
And the question often comes up is, how do those guys decide what they decide? Mm-hmm. What is the internal process? You know, sometimes you like a decision, sometimes you don't.
Mhm.
Sometimes you say they didn't go far enough, they could have done this. But
Unknown caller.
I'm sorry.
that's it. They could have given us some guidance here that they didn't do. I mean, what are these guys thinking, guys and gals who are up in the Supreme Court? Can you help us understand that?
Sure. There are some competing values. You have an issue that needs a resolution. You can go deep and broad and try to answer every possible contingency. A lot of times that's a mistake because you can't really anticipate everything, and not everything has been argued. Or you can focus more narrowly, resolve the issue before you fairly, completely, publicly, and then maybe give some guidance, but leave some things for the future, which is what I usually did. Because I found that it just wasn't wise, it wasn't prudent to try to do too much in one sitting. But there is this awareness that you're writing for history. You look at those books, and you look at your name in some of those cases, and the names of people who preceded you, and that keeps you going every day, trying to be as right as you can, as correct. Now, I wasn't always right. Sometimes I went back and read a Court of Appeals opinion I'd written, and I said, oh my God, really, I said that? I didn't think about this, I didn't think about that. But that's natural, you grow with the job.
Well, also, when you get to the Supreme Court, you have a different perspective,
Yeah,
given what you just said before.
right,
Than you did on the Court of Appeals.
right. You knew on the Court of Appeals, if you were wrong, there was someone there to catch you, the Supreme Court. Now, I was reversed very rarely when I was on the Court of Appeals. I'd like to think because I worked hard and usually got it right. But there's no one there to catch you on the Supreme Court, except for the occasional U.S. Supreme Court, but that's very rare, once every 10 years or so. And so there is this gnawing feeling of you've got to get it right. So you go over it again and you go over it again, be as sure as you can. Now, at the same time, you have to get your opinions out. There's the public waiting. There are the parties, the lawyers, the judges, and so you have to walk a line, a fine line, being thorough but not too thorough. To function, there's a difference between law and academia. Academia, if you're going to write a book or write an article, you've got almost as much time as you need to get everything, every possibility right, every possible footnote. That's not the function. I had many discussions with my law clerks. I'm not a law professor. This is not a book we're writing. This is an opinion. We keep it as short as we can, concise, cogent, and get on with it.
What you're doing is, for me, is you're bringing up something that you said earlier in our discussion. And that was, if you're going to be in the law, you really have to have a taste for it.
Yeah.
All right? And can you add to whatever you've said before regarding that particular issue?
Yeah, I've known people in the law who, unfortunately for them, really didn't belong. Now, they may have been very good at other things. They may have been a great artist or a great mathematician or things like that. And somehow they got into the law for whatever reason, only to find out it wasn't a good fit for them. They weren't that good at it. Most of the time they knew it. And the fortunate ones were able to pivot and go on to something else. But I knew from the very beginning that this was my home. This is where I really did belong. And one reason was because of the uncertainty of it all. There wasn't just one answer. There's never just one answer in the law. It's always balancing and weighing among competing answers, usually good answers. On the Supreme Court, there was always more than one way that you could go, or at least almost always. And so you had to weigh and balance it. You had to work hard. You had to really dig deeply for precedents and scholarship and things like that to inform your decisions. And have good law clerks. I was very fortunate in the law clerks that I hired. I hired smart people who could write. Stan Frost told me, always hire a law clerk who's smarter than yourself. And for the most part, I did that. You know, I was very lucky. And I always told them, I had a great relationship with my law clerks. And when I retired, they all threw me, we had a lunch together. They told me about the wonderful times they had. I turned out to be a very good teacher. I had a very close dual, open relationship with my clerks, where I would talk about the things that they were working on every day. We'd have a meeting, sometimes more than once during the day. And it would be a slow evolutionary process through that opinion writing process. And they loved all of that because they learned an immense amount. And I told them, is you can say anything you want to me. You can tell me I'm wrong. You can do this or that. No hard feelings. The only one unforgivable sin is if you think I'm wrong and you do not tell me. That I will never forgive. I said, really? You want us to do that? Yes. And they did. They came and told me. I remember one incident with two law clerks. It was it's kind of an amusing story if I can digress a little bit. It was where a young man had been accused of sexual assault on a woman a girl that he had a relationship with. They were high school kids. So the evidence for the prosecution, part of the evidence for the prosecution, and he'd been convicted, appealed to the Court of Appeals, and then to the Supreme Court. Part of the evidence, the damning evidence against the young man, and his defense was that we had a consensual relationship. This was not rape and so forth. We had a consensual relationship, and then she changed her mind. Her parents were fundamentalist Christians. She was terrified of her parents, and so she made up this story. That was his defense. So part of the damning evidence against him was that she had certain bruises in her private parts, from this sexual intercourse. And the theory was those bruises show force, right? Sounded convincing to me, And so initially we were going to affirm the conviction. My law clerks came into, both young women, my law clerks came into me, sat down, they were working on the case, sat down one day, sort of hemming and hawing, they were a little nervous. I said, we want to talk to you, Justice. I said, fine, what about this case? We think you got it all wrong. Really? Tell me. He says, well, you're relying so much on the forensic evidence of this bruising. And then they're sort of awkward, I realize it's probably been a long time for you. Can you believe it? But teenage sex is sort of that way. Because neither side knows what they're doing, so they make all kinds of mistakes. I'm thinking, this is an original conversation that we're having, the three of us. And they did convince me. Well, they convinced me to take another look at it, a fresh look at it. And I eventually found that persuasive, and we went the other direction. We went to reverse the conviction. And I think that was the right way. So that's the kind of relationship I have with my clerks. And I had those discussions, not usually as lively as that would be. But I had that kind of relationship, and I benefited enormously. They may not have had the experience, but they were young, they were energetic, they just loved every day of digging into things.
So how about your relationship with the other Supreme Court justices when you were on the court? And I'm not asking you to name names.
Right.
I'm asking you to talk
Thank
about
you.
that generally.
Thank you. On the Court of Appeals, with one glaring exception, I had great relations, and they were all wonderful people, great judges. I was proud to be a member of them. And in my farewell speech to them, I said, I have good news and bad news. The good news is I'm moving up to the Supreme Court. The bad news is I'm moving up to the Supreme Court. I have to leave all of you. There were some tears. I can still remember that moment. So that was almost uniform over 8+ years with I don't know how many different judges. The Supreme Court is a little different because it draws a different kind of person. There's the politics, there's the status, there's being on top. So a person's motivations are not quite the same. Being in the Court of Appeals, it's like being in a factory, in a work factory. If you don't like to work, you're in the wrong place, you know. Supreme Court, you can not work, you can do other things, and there's really nobody to tell you any differently. But I was fortunate, not uniformly, but I was fortunate to have great colleagues. I was with Pamela Minster, who was a wonderful, wonderful person, wonderful lady, and a fine jurist, who died way too young. She was succeeded by Charlie Daniels, one of the most brilliant lawyers I've ever met in my life, and a great guy. Justice Ed Chavez, he and I collaborated every day. His office was right across the hall from mine, and we would have coffee, we'd talk about cases, and grouse and bitch, and you do all the things that colleagues will do about things. And so you know, and I had good relations with Justice Cerny and Justice Mayes, just not as close, I would say. But I valued all of them. I mean, they all were there for a reason, and they all had things to offer, to add. So you always read things by them and solicited their views, and sometimes you agreed, sometimes you didn't, but collegiality is really, really important. Small court like that where you're literally on the same hallway and you can't help but see each other all the time. You better work to get along.
So I asked you this before, and then we got off a little different direction. The process for the people who are not part of the court, for the lawyers like myself that are working at a lower level in the civil area. You have a case at the Supreme Court. You go in and you argue it, you do the briefs, you do the best you can, and you answer the judge's questions, who invariably would interrupt you during your finest point.
Right, of course, that's our job.
And so, the court would retire and you'd go into the court room or something like that. And then the attorneys on the other side, or on both sides, are talking in the courtroom. What happens there, without divulging any specifics?
Right. Well, it's pretty well known. In the normal case, we've read the briefs, done some work with the record, maybe asked our clerks to do some research at major points, depending on how difficult or challenging the case may be, before oral argument. I always loved oral argument. I'm not unanimous in that. Some judges think it's just a waste of time and they'd rather stay in their office and work. I disagree. I always learned something from oral argument, always. Sometimes it reaffirmed an earlier leaning, a predilection I had, and sometimes it changed my mind. That happened as well. So you do argument and you ask those questions, and I was always pretty aggressive. I remember when Chavez was new to the court, he was in the junior seat, way over here, and I was in the next seat, which was way over here, and the other three were in the middle. And he and I were the most aggressive questioners. So the poor lawyer would be going back and forth like that. I found argument invaluable. I always voted for it. Then you retire, and you have, there's a little table in there, and you sit around the table. It's very formal. Court of Appeals was not as formal, but the Supreme Court is. And you take an initial vote, and you start with the junior justice. How do you think? What do you think of the case, and what's your vote? So the junior justice would start off, explain his view of the major issues and the facts, and how he was leaning and why. And then you go to the next most senior and the next most senior, and so forth. The Chief Justice was always the last to speak, which made the Chief Justice's job a little easier, because you were the last one to speak. You could pretty much say, I agree with this side, or I agree with that side. Now that vote was not binding. It was initial, it was a straw vote, and it was not recorded, other than just by the five of us with our internal note taking. And everyone knew that any one of us was free to come to a different resolution eventually. So then normally, sometimes somebody would write a memo after that, trying to persuade or doing some additional research. But in the normal case, the author was already selected at random by the clerk of the court. So you knew that whether you were the author or not. If you weren't the majority, then you had to make some changes, but usually that wasn't a problem. And so then you'd start working on the case, and then a matter of months later, you'd circulate a draft. And then your colleagues would have to refresh themselves because they've long since gone on to other things. And then they would respond, agree, don't agree, sometimes write a memo. And then you had your majority, or in most cases, we were unanimous in our opinions during my experience at the Court of Appeals, on the Supreme Court, which was a conscious effort. As you know, having looked at New Mexico case law, there's not a lot of books out there. There's not a lot of jurisprudence in New Mexico. It's a small state, it's a young state. And so my view was always, the more opinions, the better, to flesh things out, to provide guidance for the future. But that only works if you have, it doesn't work if you have split opinions. If you have 5 different opinions, then nobody knows what the law is. So we made a conscious effort not to dissent or specially concur unless it was really important. And during my time on the court, I dissented occasionally. I specially concurred. Probably my most important opinion was the special concurrence that I can get to in a second. But most of the time, we consciously tried to speak with one voice, which I think was good for the jurisprudence, good for the lawyers and judges, I think. That's always we didn't want to be like the Supreme Court, writing multiple opinions and nobody knowing what the law really was. We made a conscious effort not to be like them.
So, when somebody is disagreeing with the majority, sometimes they just disagree, and other times they actually write a dissent.
Yeah.
What kind of impact does the dissent have on the people who voted with the majority?
You know, in the routine case, that initial vote stood. People's minds didn't change often. Now, in the more challenging cases, it might, depending on the issue. Frankly, by then, you've already thought about it, you've done your work, and you've sided with one side or the other. You're probably not going to be persuaded by a dissent. So why write a dissent? You write it for history, for ego, or you write it for, you think this is an important issue and you think the law may change in the future, and you want to provide a blueprint. Dan Sosa did a lot of that when he was on the court, and a lot of his dissents became majority opinions later on as the court shifted over time. A special concurrence is sort of has a different value. I wrote a very important special concurrence, and part of it was because the majority opinion, with which I agreed, I have the name of that case, the Elaine photography case, involving the photography company who would not take the wedding photos because it was a gay marriage, because it went against their Christian fundamental beliefs. Very challenging case. So I wrote a special concurrence in that, which received wide attention. I worked very hard on it. The reason I wrote it is because the majority opinion didn't have the time. They had to deal with like 6 issues. And they didn't have the time to deal with what I thought was the most important issue. They dealt with it. I agree with it. I thought it needed to be fleshed out more. And I wrote only on that. So I had the luxury of concentrating and paying attention to that only. That opinion has been widely commented on, widely well received, widely acclaimed. It was probably the best opinion that I wrote ever as a judge. It was towards the end of my term on the Supreme Court. And it definitely is the opinion that got me the most attention nationwide. I got more mail from people all over the country, usually against my opinion. You can imagine where they were coming from. Generally speaking, respectful in their talk. Sometimes not so respectful.
Any other cases that you were part of at the Supreme Court that you thought were especially significant?
Um,
Or is that too broad a question?
Yeah, it is too broad. There's just so many. Because most of the time, even if you're just affirming a conviction on a search and seizure issue, and the last thing we usually need is another search and seizure opinion, you know? We need opinions in the other areas like oil and gas, commercial law, things like that. But generally, even that, they provide guidance, so they're important. I remember an opinion I wrote, I just had a senior moment. I can't remember what I should about the opinion, but that changed the whole law in an aspect of criminal law, and that was important, you know. And I spent a lot of time on that. Then there were, well, go ahead, ask the next question.
This is a broad question also, is that you've been involved in the legal communities, but specifically the New Mexico legal community, well over 50 years. How has the legal community changed during that period of time?
I was kind of thinking about that question when I started to prepare for this meeting. You know, when I started in 1969, I didn't pass the bar until 1970, so though we were practicing law, I was usually with a licensed attorney. You know, Albuquerque, the second judicial district, had 6 judges, and they did everything: criminal, civil, family, children, everything. 6 judges, no specialization, no nothing, and they had a lot of jury trials in those days. I don't know how they did it. To make matters even worse, there was no 13th judicial district, so they had Sandoval and Valencia County thrown in extra into the second judicial district. 6 judges. Now they're just in the second, they're 25, 28, so I don't even lost count. A lot of district judges. Santa Fe had 2 judges for Santa Fe, Rio Arriba, and Los Alamos. And similarly reflected in Las Cruces and these other places. Now you've trebled or quadrupled the number of judges. And it's needed because the law is much more complicated now than it used to be. A lot more causes of action, a lot more complexity in criminal cases, all of that, constitutional issues. So it's much more complex. Unfortunately, it's much less personal, more impersonal. I remember one of the first times I was in court in Albuquerque, sitting in the courtroom waiting for the proceeding to start. My opposing counsel walks out of the judge's office, arm in arm with the judge. I said, I think I remember somewhere in the rules that's not supposed to happen.
Happened all the time?
Happened all the time. Things were much more casual in those days. Now, you know, you couldn't imagine that happening now. There'd be a huge uproar, and appropriately so. So it's much more structured and less personal. You don't get, the relations I had with district judges in Santa Fe and Supreme Court judges in Santa Fe would be impossible today. I used to go into Tom Donnelly's office, Bruce Kaufman's office in the district court and just shoot the breeze about this and that. And they loved it. They loved having somebody to talk to about things, someone they enjoyed talking to. So that's, the loss of that personal relationship is an unfortunate aspect of it. Everything's a lot more complicated, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Take pretrial detention, big hot button issue these days. You know, and politically a big issue, and lots of dissension and feuds going back and forth. And yet, the Constitution of the state of New Mexico had since the 1960s said that the presumption would be release, not bail, not detention. And yet that has simply never been addressed and never been incorporated, just ignored. And I have nothing against the bail bond industry, but it provided, the result is you had two classes of criminal offenses. People with money, out they go. People who didn't have any money, they stayed and rotted in the jails, pending their trial, just because of of the money issue, just because they didn't have, that isn't right. Now, some people belong in jail pre-trial, for sure, based on flight risk, based upon danger to the community, those things which the focus is shifted to now. But that took decades for that to unfold. And Charlie Daniels was the principal actor in that. He got hold of the case and decided to write extensively on it, and he did. And it was a wonderful opinion. I signed off on it. And it was just about all of that. And that led to the changes we see now, which are still in flux, because that's just, that nobody's satisfied with the way that's done. I hope we get to a resolution, because it's been going on now for several years. I think the standard of practice is much higher than when I first started. I remember a lawyer, famous lawyer from Santa Fe, up in a case, saying to the judge, I kid you not, there's a precedent on point that supports my position, Judge. Now, I can't remember the name of the case, but believe me, trust me, it's there.
I know who you're talking about.
Really? Really? Now, you know, today you would never get away with that, and you shouldn't. I think the standard is much higher. I think with specialization, you get better lawyers. From my vantage point as an appellate judge, the standard of appellate practice increased dramatically. You have lawyers who specialize now in appellate work. And I always told lawyers that I knew, particular personal injury lawyers, I said, you may be the greatest trial lawyer in the world, but you're a damn fool if you take that case yourself on appeal. You need a fresh pair of eyes. And there are people who can give you that, who are really good, and they're good writers too. And you may not be a good writer. You're a good orator, but not a good writer. And so, oh no, but I like my appellate practice. I said, well, it's your call, but let me tell you, I think you're making a mistake. I saw some of the best appellate judges, best lawyers in the state. And I thought about a few, and I'm going to leave people out by omission, by inadvertently, but I think Chuck Pfeiffer is one of the best appellate lawyers imaginable, anywhere. Ed Rico is phenomenal with the Rody firm. Steve Tucker, who was in Santa Fe now, he's retired, but he was terrific. God, the woman lawyer used to be with the Miller firm. Alice Lorenz, wonderful appellate lawyer. I don't want to leave her out. And there are others that I can't remember. But it's good that that is a specialty. There's a way to make an argument. I used to, when I would talk to the Appellate Bar Association, I said, look, there's a way to make an appellate argument, both in writing and then when you have your oral argument. Nothing requires that it be boring. Nothing requires you to be boring. Use your imagination. Try to make it interesting. Appellate practice is all, and trial work too, for that matter, is all about telling a story. And either you're going to interest your viewer or you're not. And if you don't, then you're facing an uphill climb. But you can make it interesting if you work at it. And the good appellate lawyers did just that. I mean, you couldn't put the page down. It was like a page turner. And then if you had another good lawyer on the other side, you were all set to go with the first lawyer. When you read the second lawyer's, oh, well, I've changed my mind. I'm going with that lawyer. And then you had your work cut out for you. But the standard of practice there is, and the standard of practice among the judges is improved radically since I started. And I credit that with the constitutional change in 1990 that created the system we know now of retention, judicial, nominating commission, appointment by the governor, stand for one election, partisan election, and then it's retention after that. Now, we have a weird hybrid. Nobody in the country has one like us. And people ask me, how come retention is 57%? That's an odd number. Who came up with that? And I said, I'll tell you exactly how it came up. It's halfway between 65 and 50. Somebody wanted 65, somebody else wanted 50. They chose 50%. And I know the people who were in the room when that decision was made. Legislature, not the judge. But because of that discipline that's required to go through the nominating commission, that's weeded out the people who just don't belong. And therefore the governor has a choice, a political choice, but he has a short list. He or she has a short list. And usually, in the great majority of cases, they're capable. They're all capable people. Whereas that wasn't the case in the early years. When I practiced in the early years, it was basically just politics. It just was.
So aside from what you've already said, and there's been plenty of what you've said today, and I thank you so much for sharing your perspective and your wisdom with us, is there anything else, words of wisdom, thoughts, perspective that you would like to share with young lawyers who are coming into the practice, or even lawyers who have been in the practice for a while? What do you want to say to them?
For me, it's been a tremendous honor to be a lawyer in New Mexico and then to be a judge and a member of the Supreme Court. A privilege and an honor to do that, and I want to make sure that's included in my remarks here. I've been very fortunate, been very lucky in my career. Get good help, good advice from people, a little phone call, a little word to the wise. You know how things work. People go to law school for all kinds of reasons. I went to law school partially because of civil rights, but then I had a lot of other interests at the same time. And sometimes those bear fruit and you have a wonderful career, and sometimes they don't. Because the practice of law has certainly not gotten any easier, and it's not gotten any more enjoyable. It's a real grind. And I know that it was a grind when I practiced, and it's only gotten more so as I talk to people my age, some of whom are still at it and not yet retired. And so it's easy to lose the ideal and lose the enthusiasm that you enjoy when you're young. That's natural, and you have to work at retaining that. How do you do that? You start with your home, you start with other interests, things to balance out your life, make changes in your practice if you can. It's not always possible to do it, but it's possible to tweak it, just how much. Or I've known people who just dropped the practice and went off and wrote a book, did something else, went into music. Don't let it consume you in a bad way. You're going to work hard, of course, as hard as you can for your cause, but don't let it consume all of your soul, all of your energy. One of the most difficult parts of being on the Supreme Court were the disciplinary cases. Disciplinary with judges, disciplinary with lawyers. I was totally unprepared for that. That just blew me away. You know, I'm sitting in judgment of these lawyers and sitting in judgment of these judges, most of whom they'd done wrong, but it wasn't, they hadn't shot somebody, you know, it was bad judgment. A lot of times it's alcoholism, drugs, and a lot of times it's psychological. The phrase we used to use is that the lawyers go on fetal, just in a fetal position. They can't face reality anymore. They can't face their practice, their clients, their family, their spouses, their kids. And that can happen with stress. That can happen. I'm so proud that we have these support groups for judges and for lawyers. Some of that came about when I was Chief Justice. Those lawyers and judges have done a fabulous job, and they've saved lives. They've saved lives. I can remember sitting on the Supreme Court. I can remember one case in particular. I won't mention his name. This guy, when he was young, was one of the brightest stars in the bar. He was the son of a former governor. He was brilliant. He clerked for the Supreme Court. He had the world in the palm of his hands. 25 years later, he's in front of me in a disciplinary case where I forget what the infraction was, but he was guilty. He knew he was guilty. His lawyer was basically just throwing him on the mercy of the court. And I forget exactly what we did in that case. We imposed some discipline. I think we gave him a chance to come back the second time. But inside myself, I'm up at the bench, and what I really would have liked to do is reach across the bench, grab him by the lapels of his suit and say, "What in the hell happened to you? I knew you win. What happened?" But I knew the answer. Life happened. And so it's important for judges to be understanding, where appropriate, to give a second chance. save lives, and where it's not appropriate to come out down hard. And I think in my years on the court, we took that a lot more seriously than maybe some of our predecessors did. It's a little too much a good old boys club, I think. But you can't have rules if they're not enforced and uniformly across the board. And I think we managed to do that during my years on the court. So these young lawyers who come out don't lose what brought you to law school to begin with. You must have had somebody that inspired you. And it isn't always like civil rights like inspired me, but something you wanted to do, some life you wanted to live. And whether you go with a big firm or some other way, you're going to be ground down. That's inevitable, but don't lose it. It's easier to say than to actually do it, but I can't tell you how important that is. You know?
Is the issue of balance between personal life and practice strongly tied to what you just said?
Yes, that's kind of what I was driving at. I was fortunate that I got into soccer because my kids got into soccer fairly deeply during high school. My son played in college. And I used to go to the games and I'd yell and scream and yell at the referees. And in one of those games, the referee was a lawyer, Michael Goldman from Santa Fe. And he comes up to me afterwards and says, "Hey, Dick, you know, I heard you from the stands." And I was, "I'm sorry, Michael." He says, "No, you'd make a good referee. You ought to come out here and do this." And I did. I refereed high school games for 15 years, all over the state, but mainly in the north. And that was a great balance for me. You know, it was great exercise. I was like a judge on wheels, as I call it. Well, without an appeal, you blow your whistle. There's no appeal for that. But it was a way for me to give back, be around young kids. Also did it with adults in the summertime. Got to know a whole segment of Santa Fe that never spoke a word of English. That was great. That was a fantastic experience, getting to know people like that. So yes, trying to retain some balance, you know, keep your marriage alive, keep the spark there. Don't mistreat your spouse. You know, they need time and consideration too. Just like, well, they should be number one on your list, not number 5 if you want to be successful. I always managed to do that, but I had a very, very understanding wife, who I still do too.
You're a very lucky man.
Very lucky.
For a number of very important reasons.
Yeah. I achieved my dream. Now, not everybody can say that. In fact, most people can't say that. That where they ended up was their dream spot, and I did. The day I walked out of there, you know, I was so grateful for the opportunity. And I could have stayed on, you know, but my wife had been saying, "Aren't you going to retire someday?" You know, you're getting kind of old. Don't be one of those guys. Be one of those guys that they say, "Oh, it's too bad you're leaving," instead of one of those guys that they say, "What took you so long to leave?" You lost it 5 years ago. And I've served with some folks like that, and it's painful to watch, you know. So I retired at the right time. A little too early, but it was still the right time. You know, I still had everything, my wits about me.
So I've been asking you all these questions. I'd like to give you an opportunity to bring up anything that you would like to have, if you have any additional thoughts or advice that you want to bring into this oral history. Go ahead.
I've inadvertently I've left out the state bar, because the state bar also is light years from what it was 40, 50 years ago. You know, it has all these programs, and they're conscious of helping lawyers and helping the community, and they reach out and they're proactive, and none of that was there. You know, they just had a small little operation. I wasn't all necessarily in favor of this building here, but I certainly am now. Back when it was built, it's been a tremendous asset, and the professionals who work in the bar are great people. You know, I was inspired, not just with lawyers in real life, but, you know, I did my share of reading. I just reread, for example, All the King's Men, you know, wonderful book. I realized I'd read it in college, and I reread it for fun. And I think I saw big things in there that I know I missed the first time around. What a wonderful book that was. It's about public life and not about lawyers, but still, it talks about ethics and morals and the conflict of life and the difficulty in keeping your path straight, or as straight as you can, and how easy it is to be seduced and go off into the wrong paths. That exists in the law practice all the time. Not so much in the judicial, it can, but in legal practice, the temptations are everywhere. And how do you stay true to yourself? That's one of those questions to which there are no answers. Philosophy is more but having something that keeps you focused and not just on the grind of the daily practice, but other things as well, family, kids, all of that, and your community. Your community. For me, I've always loved politics, but I've loved the good parts about politics. Getting to know people and community awareness and involvement. I've been fortunate, I've never had too much experience with the ugly side, though I know it's there. I'm not naive, So I can say that I've even loved that aspect of practice in New Mexico. New Mexico's been great for me. I grew up in Connecticut, a wonderful state, but a much bigger state, a lot more going on and a lot more competition for everything at the same time. Probably has some of the best schools in the world in the state of Connecticut. I came out here not intending to come to New Mexico. That was a bit of a chance, but I'm very, very lucky that I did. And New Mexico gave me a chance, an opportunity. New Mexico will treat you fairly and squarely if you treat New Mexico the same way. If you have a note of condescension in your voice, forget it. They're going to get you eventually. So I'm not that way, and a lot of people I know are not that way, but I know some who are, and they've suffered because New Mexico can be very unforgiving if you treat New Mexicans badly. But if you treat them square, it's been a great state of opportunity. They took me in. Eventually I ended up in the Supreme Court. I wasn't born and raised here, didn't go to school here, and yet they took me for what I was. So I'm enormously grateful.
Wonderful. I want to thank you very much for, first of all, your willingness to sit for this oral history, and how you were very forthcoming in terms of your experiences and your perceptions and your opinions. I think when people view this in the future, it will be meaningful to them, and I want to thank you very much,
Thank you.
Justice Bosson.
I hope it is. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you. Thanks everybody for listening.
All right.